The constable hesitated a moment before approaching her. The last of the daylight had drained from the square, leaving the lock-up in a kind of bruised half-dark. The air carried the lingering scent of stale beer and trampled carnations. Somewhere, faintly, a gramophone played the last bars of "We'll Gather Lilacs," its melody warped by distance. "Mrs. Cope," he tried again, his voice low and careful, as though speaking across ice. "You oughtn't to be out here alone." She turned then, very slowly, her eyes struggling to focus. Her hair had come loose in shining strands. The constable saw that she was shivering, though the air was not cold. For a moment, he thought she might say something. Instead, she glanced up at the beam above her. That dark, ancient timber, still faintly scarred by rope mark, and gave a small, wistful laugh. "They said it would dance," she murmured. "What would, madam?" "The beam." Then she swayed, not gracefully, and the constable caught her by the arm. He felt, absurdly, as though he had intruded upon a private ritual. When she fainted, it was with no drama, just a slow folding inward, like a child yielding to sleep. Within half an hour, she was home, her mother fussing over her with brandy and questions. The doctor, a man whose patience was long tested by domestic hysteria, found her pulse strong and advised rest. "Shock," he said firmly, "and possibly too much excitement." By morning, excitement had spread to everyone else. The constable's report, though brief, contained enough peculiarity to feed an entire town's imagination. By the time Mrs. Cradle heard it from her neighbour, who had heard it from her husband's cousin's friend on the night shift, the tale had grown to include ghostly music, levitation, and a veil that rose by itself, like it was pulled. At the police station, Sergeant Love read the constable's account twice, frowned, and took it to Inspector Pubright, who was balancing a cold teacup on an untidy pile of paperwork. "Bit of a queer business, sir," Love observed. "Bride dancing under the old gallows, says she was wearing someone else's boots." Pubright looked up with polite interest, as if Love had announced the arrival of a visiting bishop. "Ah, perhaps she mistook them for a wedding gift." Love smiled uncertainly. "The thing is, sir, they belong to someone." The constable recognized the make. "Carpenter's issue, sold only at Hingle's." "Hingle's," repeated Pubright mildly. "A reputable purveyor of boots to the sober working man. Perhaps we should make inquiries before the local imagination rebrands it a satanic relic." By midday, the imagination had done precisely that. At the hair salon where the bride had worked, the apprentices whispered theories while pretending to tidy shelves. The vicar's wife telephoned 3 friends to express grave concern, which became confirmed possession by the 4th call. Even the postmaster, a man famously immune to rumour, remarked that it's never wise to hold a wedding too close to harvest. The air's unsettled. Pubright and Love visited the Copes' residence that afternoon, a tidy, semi-detached house with curtains too carefully arranged to be anything but defensive. The bride, pale but composed, greeted them with a politeness that trembled at the edges. Her husband hovered nearby, his expression somewhere between protective and bewildered. "I can't imagine what came over me," Linda said. "I remember the toasts, and someone asking about my shoes, then nothing until I woke in bed." "Edwin said I'd fainted," Pubright inclined his head. "Do you often dance, Mrs. Cope?" "Not like that," she said with a weak smile. "And certainly not there." He let the silence linger. In it, the faint ticking of the mantel clock grew uncomfortably loud. "Do you recall," he asked, "seeing anyone near the lockup before your episode?" She hesitated, frowning. I thought I saw a man." But it was dark. "Perhaps one of the guests," Edwin shifted. "We left the square together, sir. I went to fetch her wrap. When I came back, she'd gone. Did you notice her shoes? Only that she wasn't wearing them when they found her?" Pubright nodded. "And whose boots were they?" The groom hesitated. "They looked like father's." A small sound escaped Linda. Not a word, just a breath that trembled into silence. Pubright caught it, as he caught everything without comment. When they left, Love exhaled. "You think the old man's mixed up in it?" Pubright smiled faintly. Mr. Cope Sr. has spent his career ensuring that the departed are suitably attired. It would be most unlike him to misplace a pair of boots. Love glanced back toward the house. Still, there's something off about that girl's eyes, like she's seen something she's trying to forget. Indeed, Pubright said. But in Flaxby-on-Mere, that hardly narrows the field. That evening, as dusk returned to Wantley Square, a stray breeze stirred the bunting left from the wedding. It whispered against the gallows beam, making the timber creak softly in its old sockets. A cat, disturbed, fled across the cobbles. The beam, however, remained perfectly still. By the following morning, Flaxby-on-Mere had moved from astonishment to enterprise. Every tongue was wagging and every kettle was boiling. The Flaxby Times carried a small notice: brides faint at wedding festivities, doctor reassures guests, which, while offering nothing factual, lent the event the dignity of print. That alone was enough to confirm in most minds that something thoroughly improper had occurred. At the Green Teapot Tea Room, where gossip was served hotter than the tea, Mrs. Malby of the drapery confided to Mrs. Cradle that she had personally seen a tall man in black standing near the lock-up just before sunset. Mrs. Cradle, who had seen no such thing, nevertheless agreed that she had heard of it, which in Flaxby amounted to the same. And, Mrs. Malby added triumphantly, his hat was of the kind no decent man wears since the coronation. By mid-afternoon the man in black had grown taller, thinner, and according to one witness, translucent. A few insisted he was the ghost of the last condemned man hanged in Flaxby. A poacher, or possibly a tax clerk, depending on which table one occupied. Inspector Pubright, reading the morning's accounts and the newspaper's half-column of eyewitnesses, found his tea growing cold. Sergeant Love stood at the window, peering out at the square where bunting still drooped from the previous day's merriment. "They're saying now the beam moved by itself," Love reported, half amused. "Then it joins a long tradition of inanimate objects that seek attention," Pubright replied. He turned a page, eyes narrowing slightly. "The vicar's given an interview, I see," Love grinned. "He's warning against superstition, which will of course double the congregation by Sunday." Pubright folded the paper neatly and set it aside. "Well, Sergeant, before the gallows beam starts receiving fan mail, we'd best learn whether any mortal hand has touched it." They began with the constable who had found the bride. The man, still faintly unnerved, confirmed that the boots had been dry when first seen, though a damp patch had appeared later. "Like they'd drawn the moisture out of the stones, sir," he said earnestly. Pubright, who had never known stones to perspire, thanked him kindly. He then asked for a list of guests who might have wandered from the reception. It was a long list, and, as Love observed, half of them wouldn't know if they'd wandered or not. "Sir, not after the punch." Nevertheless, by evening, they had visited 3 households and received 7 contradictory accounts. One woman swore she had seen the bride walking arm in arm with her new husband just before the disappearance. Another was equally certain she'd seen the groom talking to his father by the undertaker's van at the same moment. A third claimed to have heard music. "A kind of slow tune, sir, like the march at a funeral, but prettier." That last remark drew a faint flicker from Purbright's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Wainscott," he said gently. "You've been most helpful." Outside, Love looked puzzled. "Do you think there was music?" "In Flaxby, Sergeant," Pubright said, "there is always music. The tune merely changes with who is listening." He left it there, but the remark stayed with Love all the same. The next morning, the Times printed a small correction. The doctor had not, in fact, declared a supernatural element unlikely, as previously reported, but merely said the bride was resting comfortably. This distinction was lost on the town. Mrs. Cradle now spoke darkly of possession, while the Reverend Pottlesham devoted his sermon to the dangers of loose talk delivered to the largest congregation since the Christmas raffle scandal. Meanwhile, in the police station, a parcel arrived. The bride's shoes, returned from the Cope's household for safekeeping. Pubright examined them without comment. The soles were clean, the heels scarcely scuffed, as though they had been worn for ceremony rather than walking. He compared them mentally with the image of the muddy boots. Then, with characteristic mildness, he instructed Love to make discreet inquiries at Cope & Son regarding any missing items. The undertaker himself, Mr. Horace Cope, received them with the courteous gloom of a man whose trade forbade levity. "Boots, you say? We've more than we need, Inspector." "The departed are not fussy about fashion." "Quite," said Pubright. Still, these were a particular kind, black, size 9, thick sole, brass-studded. Cope frowned slightly. "That would be our standard issue for municipal workmen, sir. We had several pairs last month." "One might have been mislaid or borrowed." The undertaker's lips twitched. "Borrowed, Inspector, is not a term we employ here. The dead do not lend." Outside, Love muttered, "Queer old vulture, isn't he?" Pubright, who seemed lost in thought, only murmured. That evening, as the inspector returned to his modest house on Church Row, the street lamps flickered into life. A group of children were chanting a new rhyme, something about a bride, beneath the beam. He listened as he passed, the sing-song voices fading behind him, and thought, not without melancholy, how quickly innocence found its amusement in fear. Later in his study, he wrote his report in careful, even lines. Incident not yet classifiable as criminal. Suggest further observation before formal inquiry. He paused, considering the last line, then added one more note in smaller handwriting. Possible mischief concealed beneath respectability. Keep watch on the Copes. When he put down his pen, the night outside was very still. Somewhere, far off in the square, a single board creaked. Wood settling, perhaps, or something heavier shifting its weight. Pubright listened, smiled faintly to himself, and reached for his lamp. The next 2 days passed in that peculiar lull which follows small scandal in small towns. The quiet before gossip grows bored and turns cannibal. For Inspector Pubright, it was a welcome silence, one that allowed thought to take shape beneath the noise. He spent the first morning in the station's back office, reading through the constable's fuller notes. There was nothing outwardly strange in them, but something, a phrasing, a hesitation between lines, suggested to Pubright that the young man had seen more than he realized. He made a small mark in the margin and set the papers aside. Sergeant Love appeared with his usual blend of eagerness and uncertainty. "Doctor's been round to see her again, sir. Says the bride's come over quiet." Hardly speaks. "Sits by the window staring out." Pubright nodded. "Shock or something more reflective?" "Doctor says she don't remember the dancing." "Nor the boots." Pubright regarded his pen. "Memory," he said, "has its own sense of propriety. It often refuses to attend the less decorous parts of life." He closed his notebook. "Come, Sergeant, let's see what silence looks like in daylight." The Cope's house smelled faintly of varnish and carnations, the lingering perfumes of 2 trades neither particularly cheerful. Linda Cope sat by the window exactly as described, a cup of tea cooling beside her hand. The lace curtain trembled with the passing breeze, brushing her cheek each time she forgot to move. Her husband opened the door, looking tidier than grief required. He seemed grateful, if not relieved, to have visitors. "She's better today, Inspector. Still, not quite herself." Pubright inclined his head gently. "Then perhaps she might lend us a little of the person she is today." Linda turned her gaze from the window. There was no fear there, only an immense fatigue, as though something had been borrowed from her in the night and not returned. "I keep dreaming," she said suddenly. "I'm walking through the square. Everyone's watching, but they can't move. And there's music, slow like water running through pipes. When I wake, my feet ache." Her husband moved to her side. "You've not been out since, love." "I know," she said quietly. But they still hurt. Pirbright's expression didn't change, though his eyes softened. You wore those shoes only once, Mrs. Cope? Yes, they're in the drawer now. He looked toward the sideboard where the shoes lay neatly boxed, pink ribbon still crisp. If you'll permit, I should like to see them again. She nodded without protest. He examined them carefully, turning one in his hands. The faintest trace of an odor clung to the fabric, not perfume nor polish. It was faintly chemical, sterile, like the air of a room that had recently been scrubbed for surgery. Were these stored at your workplace before the wedding?
No, at home, she said. I kept them wrapped. Why?
He replaced them gently, merely curious. The scent reminds me of the mortuary, or of something that wishes to be mistaken for it. A flicker crossed Edwin Cope's face.
You don't think my father...
I think your father takes exceptional care with preservation, Pirbright said mildly. A professional habit, no doubt. One wonders whether it ever wanders beyond his trade. The groom's jaw tightened. My father wouldn't harm anyone. Certainly not, Pirbright agreed, in the tone of a man who has found agreement to be more revealing than contradiction. As they left the house, Love gave a low whistle. You think the old man's dosing people now, sir? Pirbright shook his head. If he were, Sergeant, the dosage would be precise and the symptoms tidier.
No, this feels more...
theatrical.
Someone wanted a scene, Love frowned. Then why the boots?
Because nothing unsettles a tidy mind like disorder in small things. Pirbright's gaze lifted toward the distant church spire. And in Flaxby, disorder is an unforgivable sin. That evening he stopped briefly by the undertaker's premises. Through the window he saw Mr. Cope Sr. bent over a workbench, polishing a coffin handle to a dull glow. Pirbright watched for a moment the slow, repetitive motion, the devotion to surface perfection, then turned away. The scent of formaldehyde drifted faintly into the street, where the evening air turned it sweet and sickly. Back at his office, he dictated a short memorandum to Sergeant Love. Interview with bride inconclusive. Memory loss possibly genuine, but psychological pattern suggests external trigger. Trace of preservative on personal effects. Maintain discreet observation of Cope family. Enquire into any recent deaths under their care. He signed it, folded it, and paused before placing it in the out tray. Through the open window came the sounds of the square. Wheels on cobblestone, laughter, the low hum of ordinary life returning to its course. But beneath it all, faintly and persistently, he thought he heard another rhythm. A soft, deliberate tapping, as though wood met stone in patient repetition. He looked toward the darkness beyond the square, where the old lock-up stood, and said quietly to no one in particular, "They're never content to let the dead rest long here." Then with a small sigh, he extinguished the lamp. The next morning brought drizzle, a fine,
mean sort that dampened tempers and made the pavement smell of coal dust.
Inspector Pirbright found it suited the day's errand. He and Sergeant Love walked the short distance to Cope & Son Funeral Directors, where black-painted lettering proclaimed "Dignity in Bereavement" since 1887. The bell above the door gave a sound more like a sigh than a ring. Inside, the air was heavy with varnish and lilies. A clock ticked somewhere behind the counter, its rhythm slow and deliberate, as though keeping time for the departed. Mr. Horace Cope emerged from the back room, hands faintly powdered with sawdust, his face composed in professional serenity. "Inspector Sergeant," he said, with the civility of a man who has buried better men than either of them. "Something amiss?" Pirbright smiled pleasantly. "Nothing that need disturb your morning, Mr. Cope. We've been reviewing the accounts of certain recent arrangements. A formality, you understand."
Council audit. The undertaker's eyebrows rose slightly. Ah, yes.
"Bureaucracy never sleeps, even among the deceased, nor among the living," Pirbright agreed. "Might we look at your register for the last quarter?" Cope fetched it without hesitation, A large ledger bound in cracked leather, the ink entries neat and exact. Pubright ran a finger down the columns, noting dates and names. Most were ordinary enough: widows, pensioners, one child, two elderly bachelors. Then he stopped. "Here," he murmured. "Mr. Colin Weaves, council bailiff. Cause of death, drowning." Cope inclined his head. "Tragic business. Fished out of the ornamental lake by the hall gardener, poor fellow."
"No inquest beyond the formalities."
The vicar said a few words. Purbright's tone remained mild.
"And this was before the wedding?"
2 weeks prior," said Cope. "A lonely man, they said." Pubright nodded thoughtfully, closing the ledger. "Your son mentioned the boots worn by the deceased. You recall what became of them?" Cope frowned. "Destroyed, of course. Regulation requires all clothing to be burnt if water damaged." "Quite right," said Pubright. "Yet somehow one pair escaped regulation, enough to find their way beneath your new daughter-in-law." Cope's eyes met his, dark and steady. "If you're implying impropriety, Inspector, I suggest you recall where you stand. My trade deals in peace for the dead, not mischief for the living." Pubright inclined his head slightly, the gesture both respectful and disarming. "Indeed, Mr. Cope, but peace, like varnish, can sometimes conceal more than it preserves." When they left, Love let out a low whistle.
"That old crow's hiding something, sure as taxes."
"Did you see the way he stiffened when you mentioned the bailiff?" "I did," Pubright said, buttoning his coat against the drizzle, "though I'm not yet sure whether it was guilt or professional pride." They walked back through the square. A milk cart rattled past, and from a doorway Mrs. Cradle called out cheerfully that she'd heard the gallows beam had been struck by lightning the night before. Pubright assured her this was unlikely, as the weather had been dry, but she smiled knowingly and said, "Ah, that's what makes it strange, isn't it?" At the station, Pubright wrote a brief note requesting the original report on Colin Weaves's death. When it arrived that afternoon, he read it twice, lips pursed. The constable's account was perfunctory. Body found face down near West Bank, no sign of struggle, boots removed by decay. There was no mention of a watch, wallet, or identification.
None had been recovered. He set the paper down and looked out of the window.
Across the square, the lock-up stood dark beneath its beam, rainwater glistening on the old wood like oil. He remembered the faint chemical scent on the bride's shoes and thought again of Cope's workshop. "May I see it?" Cope's expression flickered, something between reluctance and caution. But he nodded. From the pocket of his overcoat he produced a small envelope, inside which lay a simple brass band. Pubright turned it over in his gloved hand. On the inner surface, faintly scratched, were 3 letters. LFC Pubright handed it back. "A pity no one claimed it." "None to claim," said Cope. Pubright smiled faintly. "Perhaps not yet." When the undertaker turned away, Pubright stood a long moment beneath the dripping trees. The initials glimmered in his mind: LFC, Linda Firth Cope. The same as the bride's new name. He walked back through the wet square, his umbrella barely open, as though the rain itself were useful for thinking. Somewhere above, a shutter creaked, and the sound echoed faintly from the lock-up's beam. A hollow whisper that might have been wood, or memory, or something older, still waiting to be named. By the next morning, the rain had gone, leaving the cobbles slick and shining. The square smelled faintly of wet brick and paraffin, the sort of scent that made Flaxby seem both freshly washed and faintly guilty. Inspector Pubright arrived early at the station, where Sergeant Love was already at his desk, frowning at a note. "Message from Council Works, sir," Love said. "A fellow named Kettle wants a word." "Says it's about that old gallows beam." Pubright took the note, eyes narrowing slightly. "Kettle," he repeated. "Ah, yes, a builder, part-time contractor, amateur philosopher when sober. Let's not keep him waiting." They found Mr. Kettle in the yard behind the council shed, smoking industriously beside a wheelbarrow of damp gravel. He was a broad man, red-faced and apologetic by nature, who seemed to consider conversation a form of manual labour. "Morning, Inspector."
"I reckon you'll want to hear this before it gets twisted about," he began.
"See that beam and the one at the lock-up ears weren't always there." Pubright smiled politely. "So I've heard whispers, Mr. Kettle. Enlighten us." "Well, sir, it were me took it down last month. Council said it was a hazard.
Worm-eaten, you know.
I hauled it off to my yard, was going to cut it for garden edging.
Only next thing I know someone's hauled it right back." "When was this?"
2 nights before the wedding. I came in Monday morning and it were gone. Thought one of the lads had shifted it, but no one touched it."
"Vanished clean off? Did you report it?"
Kettle looked abashed. "Didn't seem worth the paperwork, sir. Figured some decorator had nicked it for a feature. People pay daft money for old wood these days." Pubright nodded. "Describe the man you think might have taken it." "Didn't see him, sir, but a neighbour said a cart came past about midnight. Horse-drawn old kind. Said the driver wore a long coat and hat. Looked like he'd stepped out of a bleeding melodrama. Couldn't see his face, but she swore he turned by the square." "Did she say which way he went after?" Kettle scratched his head. "Toward the undertaker's yard, far as she could tell. But she's half blind, that one." Pubright thanked him, signed his notebook, and started back toward the square. Love trudged beside him, muttering, "Horse cart, middle of the night, old beam turning up where the bride faints. It's all too neat, sir."
"Like somebody setting the stage." "Indeed," Pubright said, glancing at the cobbles.
"And our Mr. Cope does rather enjoy a polished presentation." They paused by the lock-up, now cordoned off at Pubright's order. The beam loomed above the doorway, streaked with rain and age, its grain scarred and dark. Pubright studied it for a long moment, eyes thoughtful. "A man doesn't move timber like that without reason." "Symbolism is heavier than oak, Sergeant, but some still find strength to carry it." Love shivered. "If it was the old man, sir, what's he trying to say?" Pubright turned to him, voice calm but precise. "Not what, Sergeant? Who?" That afternoon, Pubright paid another visit to the council office. The clerk, a round woman of imperious tidiness, produced the record of recent works. The removal of the beam was noted, signed by Kettle, and approved by a Mr. Colin Weaves, council bailiff. "Mr. Weaves again," Pubright murmured. "Even in death he continues to author our paperwork." The clerk looked up. "Strange man, Mr. Weaves. Always lingering after hours, making sketches of things. Bits of the town he said might disappear. Like that beam, I recall. Said it was honest wood." "Honest wood," Pubright repeated softly.
"And did he have any associates?"
"Oh, yes. Came in often with the undertaker's son. Edwin Cope. They were thick as thieves till Weaves was let go, some trouble over receipts. Nothing serious, mind you, just mislaid payments." Pubright thanked her and left. Outside, Love was waiting with the motor running. "You're thinking the bailiff and the groom were in something together, sir?" "I'm thinking," said Pubright quietly, "that a man who knows which accounts vanish can also know which ledgers bury them." They drove to the outskirts of town, where Kettle's yard sprawled among the nettles. There, beneath a tarp, lay a heap of wood scraps and nails, remnants of the beam's former resting place. Pubright picked up a splinter, ran his thumb over it, and sniffed faintly. "Creosote," he said. "Fresh. Someone wanted this to look older than it was." Love frowned. "But why age wood that's already ancient?" "Because, Sergeant," said Pubright, "the truth in Flaxby must always be older than the lie. It lends it respectability." As dusk fell, they returned through the square. The lock-up stood silent, the beam casting a crooked shadow across the cobbles. Pubright stopped, hands clasped behind his back. "We have a man who moved wood, a man who drowned, and another who remembers neither dancing nor reason. What connects them, I wonder? Grief, greed, or something subtler? Guilt dressed as tradition." A gust of wind stirred the bunting left from the wedding, and one torn strip caught on the beam, fluttering like a forgotten ribbon. Pubright watched it until it stilled. "Find out who ordered Weaves's burial expedited," he said softly, And check the undertaker's invoices for that week. Love nodded, already noting it down. Love nodded, already noting it down. Pubright lingered another moment. In the silence, he fancied he could almost hear the echo of the bride's bare feet turning on the stones, slow and soft beneath the hanging timber. Then he drew his coat tighter and walked on, his steps measured, as though keeping time with something unseen and quietly waiting to be revealed. The following morning broke pale and thin, the kind of light that seemed reluctant to reveal anything clearly. Inspector Pubright arrived at the station to find Sergeant Love waiting beside the notice board, a small brown envelope in his hand. "Post came early, sir." This was left at the vestry bin according to the verger.
He thought it looked
peculiar. Pubright took the envelope, turning it between his fingers. The paper was thick, slightly warped by damp, the address scrawled in uncertain block letters. Mrs. Linda Cope, Church Street, Flaxby-on-Mere. No return name, no postmark. He slit it open with a penknife. Inside lay a single folded sheet, a cheap notepaper bearing a crude charcoal drawing of a gallows. Beneath it, in uneven script, were 5 words. "You'll hang for what you did." He studied it for a long moment before sliding it back into the envelope. Where exactly was it found? "Vestry waste bin, sir. Wrapped up in yesterday's hymn sheets. The verger said he empties it every morning." "Could have been tossed there after the wedding." "Could have," Pubright murmured. "Or placed there later by someone who wanted to give the impression it had been." Love frowned.
You think someone meant to frighten her?
Pubright gave a faint smile. Someone meant to remind her. There's a difference. They walked together through the drizzle to the church, where the verger, a small man whose devotion to gossip matched his devotion to God, met them at the door. He confirmed the discovery, adding that the letter had been folded neat as any offering, and that no one but the choir had been in the building since Sunday service. The bride was here Wednesday evening, he added.
"Came to speak with the vicar."
"Private matter," he said. Pubright thanked him and asked for the vestry key. Inside, the air was heavy with polish and damp paper. On the desk lay hymnals freshly stacked. The inspector ran a hand over the smooth surface, leaving a faint trail in the dust. Someone had leaned here recently. From the doorway, Love asked, "Should we tell her about the letter?" Pubright didn't answer immediately. He was studying a candle stub, its wax unevenly melted. "No," he said at last. "Not yet. Fear has a habit of telling its own stories if left alone," said at last. "Not yet. Fear has a habit of telling its own stories if left alone." They left the church and crossed to the vicarage, where the Reverend Pottlesham received them with his usual mixture of piety and apprehension. He admitted to speaking privately with Mrs. Cope, but insisted the subject had been purely spiritual. "She felt herself," he said delicately, "somehow responsible for events beyond her conduct. I advise prayer, not police." "An admirable distinction," said Pubright.
"Did she mention the beam?"
"She did. Said it was wrong for such a thing to have returned. That it shouldn't be standing where her happiness began. I told her such thoughts were superstitious, which she found comforting, no doubt." The vicar coloured slightly. She seemed
unconvinced. When they returned to the station, the day's post had brought the coroner's final note on Colin Weaves, death by misadventure, no suspicious circumstances.
Pubright read it twice, folded it, and placed it quietly in his drawer. "The dead," he said softly, "are rarely so considerate as to die without suspicion." By late afternoon, word of the letter had escaped, not through Pubright, but through Sergeant Love's landlady, who had overheard more than she was told. By evening, half the town was certain that the bride had received a curse. Mrs. Cradle claimed the writing was definitely foreign, while Mrs. Malby insisted the gallows drawing was identical to one she'd once seen on a packet of poison. The Reverend Pottlesham preached an impromptu reflection on the trials of the righteous, ensuring the story would reach even those too devout to gossip. Pubright reading the latest Flaxby Times, noted with weary amusement the headline, "Bride's Letter of Doom, Authorities Baffled." He had given no comment, yet the article quoted him as saying, "Inquiries continue with grave interest," which he privately admired for its accidental precision. At dusk, he walked alone through Wantley Square. The lock-up loomed ahead, its beam black against the pale sky. Something about its angle caught his eye. The end of the timber seemed freshly scraped, as if a rope had rubbed there recently. He touched the mark. The grain was clean, new. He turned as a cart rattled by, the driver's hat pulled low. For an instant, Pubright thought the man glanced toward him, though in the half-light it could have been nothing more than shadow. The horse clopped steadily on, hooves echoing against the cobbles. When he returned home, he set the envelope on his desk beneath the lamplight. The drawing looked more childish now than menacing, yet something in its careless boldness troubled him. The strokes were confident, almost practiced, as though the writer had made more than one. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Letter likely placed within church, by person familiar with routine. Symbolic intent, reference to punishment, not death. Gallows as motif recurring. Investigate handwriting. Possible connection to deceased Weaves or Cope family." He paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added a final line. "Fear travels faster than truth. Useful if one keeps pace." Outside, a clock struck 9. Somewhere down the street, a child began singing the same macabre rhyme that had followed the wedding. The bride beneath the beam, she danced and didn't dream. The tune drifted on the night air, fading as Pubright closed the notebook and sat in silence, listening to the town breathe around its secret. The morning after the letter's discovery began with fog, thick and indifferent, muffling the sound of hooves and church bells alike. Inspector Pubright walked to the station through streets that seemed half asleep, the mist curling around gas lamps like breath from something not quite living. Sergeant Love was waiting by the stove, hat in hand, his face paler than usual. "They've found him, sir," he said. Pubright hung up his coat. "Found whom, Sergeant?" "We've mislaid so many lately. Colin Weaves, sir."
The bailiff.
Dead again, this time for certain. Pubright paused, studying him.
"Ah, so the first burial was premature or the second unnecessary?"
Love swallowed. "Pulled from the ornamental lake, sir. The gardener spotted a coat floating by the reeds. Doctor says he'd been there since last night." "There now a dead man has returned for clarification," Pubright murmured. "Best not keep him waiting." The scene by the lake was quiet, almost reverent. Mist hung low over the water, and the gardeners stood in a nervous cluster near the bank. The body lay half-covered on a canvas sheet. Pubright approached without hurry, his expression unreadable. The face was unmistakable. Colin Weaves, council bailiff, the man whose name had already been written in the undertaker's ledger. Yet here he was again, waterlogged, pale, his hair streaked with weed. "Doctor?" Pubright asked softly. Dr. Hargreaves straightened, rubbing his hands. "Drowned, I'd say, but not recently. Body shows signs of previous immersion, remarkable preservation, actually." "Rigour passed before the second soaking." Pubright looked at him. "You mean he was dead, then returned to the water?" "Precisely, though how long between I couldn't guess. The conditions, peculiar." The inspector crouched beside the corpse.
"His boots?"
"Gone again," said Love quietly. Pubright nodded, eyes lingering on the cuffs of the man's trousers. "Clean above the ankle," he murmured. "Someone cared enough to wash him before sending him back." They stood in silence a moment longer before the body was carried away. As the bearers lifted the stretcher, a gold ring slipped from one of the fingers, clinking softly against the stones. Pubright stooped to pick it up. "Brass, not gold," he said, turning it over. Inside the band, faint but legible, were the same initials. LFC Love stared. Same ring as before, sir? Either that, said Pubright, pocketing it carefully, or a perfect reproduction. It appears the dead man wished to return a gift. By afternoon the story had already reached every house with a window. The town, which had grown comfortable in its fear of the bride, now shifted its dread to the water. Children dared each other to run to the lake and touch the reeds where weaves had floated. Mrs. Cradle announced that she'd dreamt of him the night before, sitting up in his coffin, humming like a kettle. At the police station, the coroner's clerk arrived to retrieve the first death file, muttering that he'd never seen such confusion in paperwork or corpses. Pubright offered him tea and returned to his desk. Love. Uneasy, said. It's like somebody wanted him found twice. Wanted him remembered twice, Pubright corrected. Death loses its authority when it's repeated. He opened a folder and withdrew the undertaker's invoice for Weaves's burial. Look here, he said. Paid by the council, yes, but the witness signatures differ. The first line, Edwin Cope. The second, Horace Cope. Love frowned. Father and son both signed off? Indeed. An admirable family collaboration. That evening, Pubright called on the younger Cope. Edwin answered the door, looking unshaven, eyes ringed with fatigue. I've heard, Inspector, he said before Pubright spoke.
It's horrible. I thought he was already buried. So did we all, said Pubright gently. Tell me, Mr. Cope, how well did you know Mr. Weaves?
We worked together on council jobs.
He kept the books. I only helped him now and then. He was decent enough until he stopped. Until?
Edwin hesitated. He asked Father for money, said he'd found something
irregular in the records. Father told him to mind his own business, and then he stopped coming by.
A week later, they said he'd drowned. Purbright's gaze did not waver. And when your father prepared the body, did you assist? Edwin nodded slowly. I helped lift him to the table.
He swallowed.
He looked peaceful. Father said best not to ask questions. The council wanted it quick. Quick burials suit many people, Pubright said quietly. Especially those who prefer their mistakes covered rather than corrected. The young man's face tightened.
You think my father...
I think, Pubright interrupted, that Mr. Weaves was too tidy a man to drown twice by accident. He left without waiting for a reply. Outside, the air had cleared, the fog lifting into thin ribbons. From the undertaker's yard came the faint creak of wood on metal, the sound of a coffin lid being adjusted. Pubright paused, listening. Then, as if concluding a private conversation with the dark, he turned away. Back at the station, he wrote his report by lamplight. Body recovered. Condition inconsistent with prior interment. Evidence of tampering post-mortem. Link between Weaves and Cope family confirmed. Recommend discreet inquiry into burial practices and council payments. At the bottom of the page, he added, almost idly, if guilt is a kind of preservation, some in Flaxby may yet prove immortal. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. Somewhere, perhaps from the direction of the undertaker's shed, came the faint sound of hammering, rhythmic, careful, the steady pulse of a craftsman finishing what he had begun. Inspector Pubright did not sleep much that night. The rain had returned, tapping at the window with slow insistence, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck the hour without conviction. He sat in his chair, the lamp dimmed to a halo of yellow, staring at the brass ring resting on his blotter. Its inscription, LFC, glimmered faintly in the low light, as though waiting to be acknowledged. There were patterns forming, he thought, though still faint as mist. A dead man who refused to stay buried, an undertaker who signed his own proof of innocence, and a bride who danced beneath the shadow of her own initials. In Flaxby-on-Mere, decency had always been a form of disguise, not hypocrisy exactly, but a mutual understanding that the truth was never to be worn in public. It was what kept the place civil, and yet someone had disturbed that quiet choreography, introducing a step too deliberate to be accidental. At the station the next morning, Sergeant Love found him already at his desk, coat off, a fresh sheet before him. "You've not been home, sir?" Pubright smiled faintly. "Home, Sergeant, is where the conversation grows dull. Here, the dead are at least consistent." Love hesitated.
Council clerk brought more papers.
Weaves was drawing pay for weeks after his dismissal. Signature looks genuine, though. "Someone's been signing for him." Pubright studied the forms. The handwriting was steady, unhurried, a professional imitation. "Forgery," he said quietly, "but a polite one. Someone who wanted the money without the mess of accusation. Undertaker again?
Love ventured, possibly.
Or his dutiful son tidying his father's debts. But forgery tells us more about fear than greed. Whoever signed these wanted something maintained, a pretense still useful to them. He rose, crossing to the window. The square below was busy again, the market stalls reopening as if the town had decided to outlast its own scandal. "Look at them, Sergeant. You'd think Flaxby were incapable of deceit. The secret is not that they lie, it's that they do it with such sincerity." Love smiled uneasily. "You think they all know something?" "I think they all know what not to know," Pubright said, turning back. "And that's a rarer kind of wisdom." At midday, he took a solitary walk through the churchyard. The earth was damp, the headstones gleaming with moisture. The grave of Colin Weaves lay among the newer plots, marked by a temporary wooden cross. The soil had been disturbed again during the recovery, and rainwater had collected in shallow pools. Pubright stood there for several minutes, hands in pockets, until he noticed something small and pale lodged in the mud. A button, smooth and blackened by age. He turned it between his fingers. It was engraved faintly with the letters C, C and S. The mark of Cope and Son. He pocketed it carefully, his face giving away nothing as he left. The vicar approached along the path, umbrella tilted against the drizzle. "Sad business, Inspector." "The town's quite unsettled." "Not so much unsettled as animated," said Pubright. "Nothing revives the English conscience like proximity to sin." The vicar blinked. "I suppose that's true. Mrs. Cope's not been seen since Tuesday, you know."
Poor girl's taken to her bed again. So soon after resurrection, Pubright murmured. "It's becoming a local custom." He thanked the vicar and continued on, his shoes squelching faintly.
When he returned to the station, a note awaited him, unsigned, written in the same crude hand as the earlier threat. "He's not finished." "She knows." Love peered over his shoulder. "Meaning who, sir?" Pubright folded the paper neatly. "Perhaps our correspondent is finally including himself in the narrative. Guilt has a curious way of seeking audience." He glanced at the clock. "We'll visit Mrs. Cope this evening, but not before the town has time to expect it. Surprise, Sergeant, is an ally of truth. It catches lies before they've time to comb their hair." At 8:30, they knocked at the Cope's house. The window above flickered with lamplight, and after a moment Edwin opened the door, his expression strained. "She's resting," he said quickly. "Doctor says quiet is best." "Then we shall be quiet," said Pubright, stepping past him with the ease of habit. Linda lay on the sofa, pale against the cushions. She looked up at them without surprise.
"You found him again?" she said softly. "Yes," Pubright replied. "And you, Mrs. Cope, have you found anything you misplaced?"
Her eyes moved to the mantel, where a single envelope lay half hidden behind a vase. Pubright followed her gaze. "May I?" She didn't answer, but neither did she object. The envelope was unsealed, its contents a short note, written in an uncertain hand. "You shouldn't have told him. We all hang together if we talk." Pubright replaced it. "Did your husband know Mr. Weaves well?" Edwin spoke from the doorway. "He came to the house once or twice. That's all. Yet he seems to write often, even after death." Linda shivered. "He wanted me to keep quiet." "About the papers?" "The ledgers." "Ah," said Pubright gently. "The ledgers."
"And what did you tell him?" "That I couldn't," she whispered.
They'd show what father had done, what Edwin helped with. The council fees, the burials that weren't paid for. Her voice cracked. "He said no one would believe me." Pubright regarded her with quiet sympathy. "And now he's gone where belief is no longer a problem." He turned to Edwin. You helped him, didn't you? A few harmless adjustments to the accounts, just to keep business afloat. But Weaves wanted his share, and when he threatened to tell, your father arranged an ending that looked tidy enough for both the council and the church. Edwin's face twitched, but he said nothing. Pubright straightened his coat. You'll both have to come to the station tomorrow. We'll keep things civil. He paused by the door. Grief, guilt, even marriage, and they all require formality in this town. One must respect appearances. As they stepped into the street, Love said softly, You think she told us everything, sir? Not yet, Pubright replied. But she will. The living always envy the dead their peace. The wind picked up, stirring the puddles in the square. Above them the gallows beam creaked once, a faint, tired sound as though the old wood had begun to remember its purpose. The next morning arrived clean and brittle, sunlight falling across the square like something newly polished. Inspector Pubright, who distrusted clarity, spent most of it writing brief, unreadable notes in his small black book. When Sergeant Love entered, the inspector was stirring his tea with the absent-minded precision of a man considering the value of silence. Cope's lad and the wife are coming in this afternoon, Love said.
Should I have Constable Moore sit in?
Pubright looked up. No need. There's a kind of honesty that thrives in still rooms. Let's not frighten it, he set down his cup. Meanwhile, there's a small favour I've asked of the coroner's clerk. Word will go round by noon that Weaves's body may be exhumed for identification. Love blinked. But it won't be, sir. Purbright's smile was faint. No, Sergeant, but rumour is a more agile investigator than we are. Let's see who it startles. By midday the town was humming again. At the post office, Mrs. Malby announced that the police had found discrepancies in the undertaker's accounts, though she could not define discrepancy to her own satisfaction. At the Green Teapot, Mrs. Cradle told anyone willing to listen that they're digging him up again, and about time too. The vicar's wife, upon hearing this, declared it a mercy and promptly telephoned 5 friends to agree. By the time Pubright arrived at the Copes that afternoon, his experiment was already yielding dividends. He found Linda sitting at the window, hands clasped, pale but composed. Her husband stood near the hearth, staring into the empty grate. I hope the morning's news didn't disturb you, Pubright said mildly. Edwin turned sharply. What news? Oh, only that the late Mr. Weaves's body will be moved to confirm certain details. A regrettable necessity, but justice, like grief, occasionally requires repetition. Linda made a small, strangled sound. Edwin's face lost its colour. Exhumed? He managed. Why? Pubright regarded him kindly. The coroner's clerk believes there may have been an error in the paperwork. Something about identification.
I'm sure it's nothing. The room went quiet except for the slow ticking of the mantel clock.
Linda's hands trembled slightly, her fingers twisting a corner of her shawl. Was there anything else, Inspector? Edwin asked, his voice brittle. Merely formality, Pubright said. We'll need to confirm the items recovered from Mr. Weaves's effects. His ring, for instance.
Odd thing about rings. They have a way of returning to where they're most remembered. He let the remark rest in the air.
Edwin said nothing. Linda's eyes darted briefly toward her husband, then down again. When Pubright took his leave, he did so without haste. He had learned long ago that guilt never rushed to confession. It lingered like fog, heavy and reluctant to disperse. Outside, Love waited by the gate. They looked half dead between them, he said quietly. Half will do, Pubright murmured. It's the living half that talks. That evening, he attended the mayor's little gathering at the assembly rooms, a social obligation that offered him both distraction and observation. The town's respectable citizens stood about in small clusters, trading concern and sandwiches in equal measure. Pubright, genial but detached, accepted a glass of sherry and allowed himself to be drawn into conversation with the vicar. Terrible business, the clergyman said, this poor bride and her husband. The Lord tests us strangely, frequently, Pubright replied. "And often through the agency of our neighbours," the mayor, overhearing, chuckled without comprehension. "Still, eh? No harm done, I trust." Pubright looked over his shoulder. Through the tall windows he could see the undertaker's figure moving slowly across the square, coat collar turned up, steps deliberate. "That, Mr. Mayor," he said, "remains to be seen." By the time he left the hall, the night had cooled. The gas lamps flickered along the narrow street, and from somewhere distant came the sound of a hammer striking wood. Steady, methodical, patient. Pubright stopped outside the undertaker's yard. A faint light glowed behind the curtains of the workshop. He knocked once, softly. No answer. He waited, then turned the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy with polish and chemical sweetness. On the work table lay a coffin, half open, its lining still unstapled. Beside it, a ledger lay open. He glanced down. The last entry read, "C. Weaves, reinterment pending." That should have been enough. Pubright studied him. And yet here you are preparing him again.
One wonders whether for burial or display. For a long moment neither man spoke.
Then Cope gave a weary sigh. "You won't find satisfaction in this, Inspector." "The dead don't confess." "No," Pubright said, "but the living often do, given the right invitation." He closed the ledger gently, as one might close a prayer book, and walked past the undertaker into the cool air of the square. Behind him, the workshop door shut softly, the sound as final as earth on a coffin lid. As he crossed back toward the station, the bell of St. Jude's began to toll the hour. Each note seemed to linger longer than the last, spreading over the rooftops like a reminder. Pubright paused, watching his breath fade into the night. "There's always a moment," he said quietly, "when guilt grows tired of keeping company with its secret." And in that moment, far off, a window slammed shut in the Cope's house, sharp and sudden, as though someone had finally decided to stop listening. The following morning dawned still and colourless, as if the town itself had paused for breath. The square looked scrubbed clean of its rumours, though Pubright knew better than to believe in cleanliness of any kind that arrived overnight. He sat at his desk, the curtains half drawn, and reread the notes from the previous night's visit. Each line seemed to point towards something both obvious and invisible, the quality of truth that hid best in plain view. At 10 precisely, he sent Sergeant Love to fetch the vicar, the undertaker, and both Copes to the mayor's parlour.
"Tell them it concerns the late Mr. Weaves," he said.
"Use that tone you save for unpleasant errands. The one that makes people tidy their conscience before arriving." By noon, the small room above the council offices was arranged for the meeting. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and nervousness. The mayor, red-faced and benevolently alarmed, had been persuaded to attend for form's sake, though he muttered that he disliked situations. Pubright arranged the chairs in a semicircle rather than a table's distance apart. He found proximity made lies more effortful to maintain. They arrived one by one. Linda entered first, pale and silent, followed by Edwin, whose expression had the strained politeness of a man waiting for an inevitable verdict. Horace Cope came last, immaculate as ever, his black gloves folded neatly in his hands. The vicar hovered uncertainly near the door, looking as if he'd stumbled into the wrong kind of service. Pubright began without ceremony. "You'll forgive the informality. I dislike confrontation, and I suspect most of you do as well. We are here to bring order to an untidy chain of events, a wedding, a letter, and 2 appearances of the same unfortunate corpse." The mayor coughed softly. "2 appearances?" "Yes," said Pubright mildly. "Mr. Weaves has demonstrated unusual persistence in administrative matters even after death, an admirable quality, though not without its inconveniences." A flicker crossed Edwin's face. His wife's hands twisted in her lap. Pubright continued, voice even. "It began with a small fraud, as these things often do. Council payments recorded for funerals never performed or charged twice. a discreet arrangement between the undertaker's firm and the bailiff responsible for approvals. Each profited, none complained, Cope said quietly. You make a grave accusation, Inspector. I do, Mr. Cope, but not without evidence. Weaves's ledger was altered, payments duplicated, and when he threatened exposure, you offered him an alternative, silence or burial. You and your son arranged the second option, but haste betrayed you. The first interment was not official, merely symbolic. A coffin sealed, a name written, a body temporarily stored for convenience. Then came the wedding, your son's, and an unfortunate guest list. Pubright turned to Linda. You discovered what had been done. A ledger left open, perhaps, or a careless word. You told Weaves you would go to the police. He laughed, I imagine, thought you'd lack the courage. He left you frightened and ashamed. So when he vanished, you said nothing. Her voice trembled.
I thought it was over.
I wanted to forget, but forgetting, Pubright said gently, is never so simple in Flaxby. Your husband and father-in-law made sure of that. They hid the body properly this time, and to give the act an air of solemnity, they replaced the old gallows beam, a bit of macabre theatre to remind you of your silence. They needed you cowed, Mrs. Cope, not confessing. Edwin rose abruptly.
That's not true.
She was losing her mind, talking of beams and ghosts. Indeed, Pubright said, and who better to encourage her delusion than you? A few drops of your father's preservative in the bridal wine, perhaps? Harmless in small doses, but enough to cloud memory and make her docile. Horace Cope's composure faltered just slightly.
That's absurd, is it?
Your trade keeps such things at hand, and when her distress became public, her dance beneath the beam, you claimed shock, pitying her to keep sympathy on your side. The mayor looked appalled. Good heavens, man, are you suggesting murder? Not quite, said Pubright, his voice cooling. Only that the line between burial and murder can blur when one digs often enough. Weaves drowned once by accident, perhaps, but twice by arrangement. Someone decided his reappearance would distract attention from the ledgers, a convenient recurrence of tragedy. But the second time they were less careful. He reached into his pocket and placed the brass ring on the table. This was found in the second body's hand, the same initials as Mrs. Cope's, engraved after her marriage.
A theatrical touch, don't you think?
The perfect reminder for a guilty bride. Except Mr. Cope Sr. never imagined the inspector might recognize the craftsmanship of his own workshop. The undertaker's face had gone grey. You've no proof. I have enough, Pubright said softly. Your own ledger records Weaves's reinterment before he was found a second time. An error of efficiency, perhaps, or conscience catching up with bookkeeping.
Either way, the council will find it illuminating. Silence filled the room, heavy and fragile.
Then Linda spoke, barely above a whisper. It was Father. Edwin helped him carry the body.
I didn't know until after.
They said it was mercy, that Weaves had fallen and they'd make it look tidy. They thought I'd be grateful. Her husband turned to her, horror flickering in his eyes. Linda, but she went on, voice steadier now. He used the gallows beam because he said every town needed a warning. He wanted me to see what keeping quiet meant, Pubright nodded slowly. And so the beam danced again as beams do when swung by men with reasons. The mayor, red to the ears, rose awkwardly. Well, quite dreadful. I trust you'll see to the necessary proceedings, Inspector. Pubright inclined his head. In due course. For now, I suggest we all remember that guilt, like the weather, is best endured quietly. As the room emptied, Pubright remained by the window, watching the square below. The sunlight had faded to gold, glinting on the wet cobbles where townsfolk moved about their errands, polite, curious, untroubled. Love came in, hesitating by the door. You'll charge them, sir? In time, Pubright said. Flaxby likes its morals seasoned. They'll talk themselves into certainty before the paperwork is signed. He closed the ledger, his tone almost reflective. It's never murder alone that shocks a town, Sergeant. It's the thought that someone respectable had a reason. Outside, the church bell struck 5. The beam above the lockup threw its long shadow across the square, pointing, as always, toward nothing in particular. Morning came clear and cold, a wind sweeping down from the fens to chase the fog away. Inspector Pubright walked through Wantley Square alone, his coat collar turned up, his hat tilted slightly forward in thought. The square looked deceptively peaceful now. No bunting, no wedding laughter, only the faint scrape of a broom where a shopkeeper tidied his threshold. The lock-up stood quiet beneath its beam, the ancient timber dark and motionless against the pale sky. At the police station, a brief message awaited him. The Copes had been taken into custody without resistance. The father silent, the son pale and dazed, the daughter-in-law calm in a way that was almost relief. The charge, formally worded, spoke of conspiracy and concealment of death. Pubright read it through once, then folded it neatly into his pocket. He had arranged, for form's sake, a final meeting in the mayor's parlour. It was not a scene of accusation now, but of conclusion, a civil sorting of truths. The vicar attended at Pubright's quiet request, as did the mayor, who had insisted upon proper documentation. The room was still, the curtains drawn halfway, dust floating in the light. Pubright stood near the fireplace, the faintest curl of smoke rising from the grate. "It is not my custom," he began mildly, "to rehearse what has already been accepted, but Flaxby thrives on understanding. We are a town that prefers its tragedies well catalogued." He glanced toward the Copes. Horace sat upright, his hands folded on his knees, the pose of a man accustomed to dignified failure. Edwin sat beside him, head bowed. Linda occupied the far chair, her expression distant, unreadable. "It began," Pubright continued, "as a partnership of small deceptions, modest enough to pass for business. A few unbilled burials, a fee unrecorded here, a payment delayed there. Flaxby's dead, being accommodating, seldom complained. Mr. Weaves saw opportunity, and the elder Cope, being both practical and proud, agreed to share it, until greed demanded gratitude, and gratitude grew troublesome." Cope's mouth tightened, but he said nothing.